Currently, I run several businesses that I own, including a e-commerce retailer in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Thailand. Before that, I was APAC COO of GLG. Is an expert network company. I led about 300 plus staff across Asia. Before GLG, I also led operations in several different companies, including bus operation, actually, a very local sort of operation. Before that, I was also at McKinsey for about 5 years. So in my career, I've seen quite a lot of companies in terms of how they operate, and also led a number of them myself. Currently, I also sit on the board of BGCA, the Boys and Girls. What's the full name for it? Anyway, so we help young people with various initiatives, plus other NGOs. Now, what is operational resilience? Now, first and foremost, operations is by nature highly contextual. So in every company that I worked for in the past, the way that we run ops are quite different, and I imagine the same for NGOs. But if you look at large companies, right, the way that they prepare for the different changes and make them resistant to the external disruptions, right? You know, they invest a lot in technology, for example. So I saw on the survey, there are questions around how to digitize knowledge, how to create systems. Yes, that is indeed quite important, but let's also think about, you know, some practical resource constraint, because technology is obviously very impactful, but tech is also about scale. So if your NGO has, you know, 10, 20 people, right? There's a limit as to how much you can rely on tech to make your operations a lot more resilient. There are companies that do a lot of continuity planning, governance structures, risk control. These are all good, but I think for today, right, what I like to do is to, you know, go back to my 20-year plus experience, right, and pick the tools from the toolbox that is applicable regardless of your size. Even if you have a 10 people NGO or 100, right, that there are a number of fundamental principles that are actually practically doable in every organization. And in particular, as you think about NGOs, right, all of you are running service organizations, and your fundamental challenge is really around the people dependence. So every time you have people leave your team, or you have got some, you know, pretty good people and you got some not so good ones, right? That hugely impact your operations sort of, excellence. And so, you know, I picked a few things that, in my experience, is actually quite useful for, service organizations of different sizes. Okay. So, there are really, you know, three things that I think, in order of this importance. The first is around process, and then people, of course, because these are people, organizations, and risk management. Systems is actually also important, but then it is, as I said, right, something that requires a bit of a scale, also a bit of stability in the way that you operate in order for systems to actually make a lot of impact. So let's focus on process and people first. Now, when it comes to process, right, the aspiration, in my view, of a resilient operation is to create a self-running engine. So what good looks like is that, you know, if you as a leader is not present for a couple of weeks, things ought to still run by themselves. If you lose two of your fantastic team leaders, you should have the organizations to keep still running to a certain level of satisfaction, right? So that's the aspiration that you should get to. If you take my own example, right? Right now, I'm running 2 or 3 different companies. I could go to Japan for 2 weeks and things will still happen more or less, right? With only minor intervention on my part. When in creating the self-running engine, in the toolbox, obviously there are multiple tools that we can leverage, right? But I think there are a few things that are the most important from my experience. The first is around using a lot of checklists and templates. It's actually quite simple to use, but rather impactful. Performance management, especially if you are a NGO of only a few years old, right? How do you actually ensure that your leaders, right, are managing things in the way that you want them to manage is actually very important. Using whiteboards, I'll get to that in a minute. And finally, making changes stick. I can't overstate enough the importance of the last one. So I've seen a lot of initiatives in the past, right, of people creating beautiful playbooks, right? They codify a lot of knowledge, and that becomes a beautiful piece of document that sits on the shelf and it doesn't actually get used, right? So it's a very, very common phenomenon. So how do you actually make sure that your effort, right, really creates the impact sustainably, right, is actually very important. The second part around people, planning and trying to tackle retention as well as succession planning, using the feedback model, and I will talk about why that's relevant in this particular section. And last but not least, right, around risk management. This is, maybe the third in importance, but it's still good to have that discipline to identify what are the risks that you should be taking some actions on. So what is actually meant by creating a self-running engine? Fundamentally, the steps entails the following. Now, first and foremost, let's actually first define and measure what are we really trying to solve. There is really only that much resources that you can have in terms of codifying all the knowledge and making the changes happen. So let's tackle the things that really was going to make an impact to you. So for example, back in my days at GLG, right, there are a number of key process steps in the entire operations that makes 80% of the impact. So let's only work on those, right? And don't try to boil the ocean. You're better off tackling a few things and make it really work, as opposed to trying to be greedy and do everything and then you do a mediocre job, right? The former is always preferred. Now, the process will entail mapping out the ideal process flow and prioritizing certain improvements that you want to make in your actual operation. Now, the part two is around codifying the best practices and behaviors and explaining the why. I'll use some examples in a minute to explain what they actually mean, and then manage risks. The last part, right, and of course, right, I mean, this is by no means an exhaustive list, and the answer depends on the context that you operate in. But then using checklists to actually make the best practice happen is an essential part of it. And let me digress a little bit. I saw from the survey, right, many of you have talked about your knowledge management, right, as being one of the concerns that you have. From my experience, the knowledge management, right, needs to be integrated into the natural part of your workflow. So what I see a lot of mistakes being made is people make a knowledge management initiative, right? And then that becomes a bit of a standalone exercise. And then, you create tons of playbooks, you run trainings, you're trying to get the behavior change to happen, right? And 8 out of 10 times, right, only 10% of it actually stick for a meaningful amount of time. And the challenge, right, is that if you don't make the knowledge actually integrate into the natural way that your team actually works in, right, there's only a 10% impact that you can actually achieve. And using things like checklists is going to change that game. And I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. Creating templates. So there are so many times across different organizations that we basically reinvent the wheel 100 different times, right? Fundamentally, we use very similar documents. The plans, they look actually fundamentally quite similar, but then nobody actually makes the effort, right, in documenting everything into a template. And again, right, on the point around integrating in the workflow, right, make sure that your workflow actually uses all these templates with all the detailed tips and learnings that you have captured, integrated into those documents. Using whiteboards and review regularly. I'll go into that in a minute. It is a sometimes overlooked tool that I found rather impactful. And finally, institutionalize performance management, right? Okay, so now what you're seeing on the slide, right, is what I think the ACS team did a very good job in figuring out a checklist for checklist. But let me boil this down to you because fundamentally is actually not that complicated. The way that let me share with you how I use checklists. So when I look at my any operation that I have in any company, right? I always look at, what are a few key steps. So for example, in the previous company that I worked in, the key step is the intake conversation with a client, right? So the very first conversation with a client, right? What do you actually capture out of it? And what do you actually talk about, right? And the reason why the checklist is important is that if you ask 10 different staff to do the same intake call, right? I guarantee you're going to have at least 3 to 5 different variations of conversations. And because the way that you conduct the work is different, and therefore you're bound to miss out on a few things here and there. And then when you have a new person who joins the team, right? The guy is going to do things in a bit of a different way. So a checklist is actually quite important for standardizing the way that we operate across the entire organization. It also enables anybody who is new to the company or new to your NGO, right, to actually pick up the checklist and do things in more or less the same way, right, that you want them to actually execute on. Now to actually get this done, right, this is how I would suggest that we get this done. I will always engage my team members in creating the checklist. So the process of co-creation is quite important. And by the way, right, whatever your process is, the person who actually does it days in, days out, right, knows it better than you do. And so I will always get them to get the team members to create the document, codify all the details into the actual checklist, and make sure they are the one that will be championing it, that they will champion it in the organization in actually making it happen. And again, right, the checklist is not meant to be a standalone document. It is meant to be the way that the workflow needs to be conducted. So in my GLG days, right, we spend probably at least a good 1 to 2 months, right, to actually make sure all the staff do follow the checklist. So for example, one of the things that we wanted people to do is before you pick up the phone to call the client, you actually use the checklist to go through all the things that you want to talk about. And I myself and my team, right, we literally walk around the office all the time, right, make sure people are actually doing it. And by the way, right, when I hear that someone is missing out something, right, I always ask, did you use the checklist? Because if you did, right, you're not going to miss out that important point that you ought to have covered. Okay, so making it into part of your natural workflow is quite essential. I would not suggest going crazy on creating tons of different checklists, but I think anywhere between 3 to 5 checklists for your operation, right, is probably a sensible number to go on. Couple of tips to make this work. Checklists should always be 1 page. It should be something that can literally stick to the wall of the partition of all the staff, right? So that they can just take it and then follow that exact thing. It needs to be on their fingertips in order for this to be used. The list should at the same time be quite exhaustive and quite detailed, because what you want, right, is not just for them to follow certain steps, but also to codify all the knowledge. Whatever your process is, right, there are all sorts of different tips. 即係有啲咩騎呢位啊，有啲咩嘢要注意啊。Everything needs to be in there, right? And all these your peculiar sort of learnings that you have from your team, right, needs to be documented into this. So this is very much both a process and a knowledge management tool. Very simple to do, but rather impactful. I think this is just another example that the ACS team put together. This is actually a reasonably good example to aspire to. So what this is a surgical safety checklist. What I like about it is a couple of things. It feels pretty comprehensive, right? So every detail step that you might miss out, everything that can go wrong, needs to be captured in a checklist, so that they actually go in the right way. It is a 1-pager. It is also easy enough to follow. Yeah. The second tool that I found quite useful is performance management. Now, what does this actually mean is, of course, it's a set of tools and processes and behaviors, right, that we want people to actually follow. The main reason why this is so important for ops resilience is that we want to mitigate the people dependence and the key people risk. And as you think about your NGOs, right? Chances are you have experience where sort of your team leaders or any sort of senior people in your team, whenever they leave, right? Then suddenly, who is actually running things? How are things going to be run in the right way, right? You actually lose that. And so you want to systematize and institutionalize the way that you actually performance manage your team, so that when someone leaves, right, it's easier for the new person to step into the new role. And by the way, right, hopefully people will actually follow. You actually let the process run the organization, not have people run the organization, right? At least shift that balance, right, to the process part. And again, right, this is also a forcing mechanism to make the knowledge management actually happen. And I'll get to that in just a minute. Let me actually go to this page. Fundamentally, I will capture performance management in this particular slide. There is a whiteboard, and then there's a review cadence. It's actually quite simple in a way, but more impactful than what it appears from the surface. Now, what does the whiteboard do? The whiteboard does a couple of things. One is that we want to create a clear accountability for every single team member, and have their immediate goals being laid out. So fundamentally, right, whiteboards can look quite different across different companies and organizations, of course, right? It's all contextual. But then it really boils down to having a couple of elements. You want to set for every staff their immediate priority. These are immediate actions that they need to take. What are their immediate goals in a matter of days and at most weeks? What is the progress? We force people to raise the issues, especially in the Chinese culture. People don't always raise the red flag when they should. So this is one of the things that I use to force everyone to bring up any issues before they fester into a bigger problem, and then take steps. Now, and the reason why the whiteboard is useful is that the transparency itself drives performance and progress. Because when I used to do these whiteboard reviews on a daily and weekly basis, right, everyone wants to show up to the meeting having actually done some stuff. And if they're written down, these are their priorities, these are their goals, right? Nobody's want to say, oh, sorry, I haven't gotten to it yet, right? And so this is actually the transparency itself, right, is a driver of progress. You also want to use the board to make it easier to share workload and therefore create the mutual backups. So when it is clear on the board and in the review process what everyone is actually working on. Let's say someone got COVID or what have you, and it's off for 2 weeks, right? Someone hopefully can go to the whiteboard and say, you know what, I know what this guy is roughly working on, and therefore let me do what I can to fill into the gaps. And with the whiteboard and also the review process, that becomes a lot more feasible. And finally, provide the fact base for problem identification and solving. So after every review cadence that I do, right, I always force people to ask any red flags, any issues that we should talk about, right? And so we address any problems quite early on, and this becomes a rhythm, right? At some point. So of course that there's a bit of a process to get this to that point, but once it becomes a rhythm, right, the ops actually runs by itself. Now, the review cadence is also important in a number of ways. It's important to have a fixed agenda. And the fixed agenda is important because you want to make sure that you cover everything, but also run it efficiently. So a danger of a whiteboard is this turns into another 1 hour meeting, right? Which is a drain in your productivity, and nobody likes having too many meetings. In several companies that I worked in, my daily review is, I would say 15, 20 minutes max. And so you want the agenda to be sharp to the point, and get it done and over with. And so the rules of the game is the following, right? Everyone needs to, before the meeting, right, update the board, with what are the newest priorities, goals, progress, and issues, so that it actually becomes an efficient meeting. The leader engages each person on their priorities, and then everything is sharp to the point. Otherwise, you can take it offline. Now, I will sort of wrap this sort of section with this influence model, which is how to make changes stick. Now, this is arguably one of the most useful McKinsey framework that I've seen in my 5-year career. There are many not so useful ones, but I found this universally applicable in everywhere that I go in my career. So I would highly recommend that you actually study this. Now, when it comes to making your process changes happen, or in fact any change happen at all, it really boils down to these 4 things. Role modeling. So people need to see that you as leaders and also as peers, right, are behaving in a new way, right? So you gotta lead by the example. Lots of over communication to foster the understanding and conviction. You need to have some sort of capability building sort of element, right? So make sure people are trained both in a large training session, but also on a one-on-one basis on the new changes, and some sort of a formal mechanism. Now, to make this more real, I created a few examples. So let's say you are going to create some new checklist and templates with your codified knowledge, right? This is what I will probably do, right? I'll make sure that I myself as a leader is role modeling the actual codified best practice behaviors, okay? And I actually use the checklist and the templates, and make sure all the team, you're under my remit, right? Actually role models the new behavior. I will probably do a lot of training of all relevant team members to uplift the performance. I will probably also do a lot of one-on-one coaching until the best practices are actually done by the teams. Lots of communication around the changes, and also engaging people in co-creation, right? Which is always quite a nice way to foster the conviction, and integrate everything into the daily work, right? So all the checklists or what have you, right, needs to be part of the actual process flow of your daily work. Okay, so I would pause here and let me first take a few questions. I'm sure there are many. I've sort of went through things in a somewhat high level way because fundamentally, right, ops is around execution, right? So the theory can sound quite simple. It's all about how you actually put it into practice. So let me take a few questions and then let's do some action planning. Any questions? So the influence model is very much how I would deal with it. I think let's first of all define what the pushback might be, right? So and let me respond to your question by drawing on some common sort of examples, right? In my past, there's some pushbacks, right, that come from what I would call detractors. So in every organization, right, you're going to have someone who is either cynical or somehow unhappy, or they are just, of a certain tenure, right, and they think that they know it all, even if they don't, right? So that's what I deal with. Let me answer your question by sharing several ways that I used to tackle these things. So back in my days at the bus company, and the bus company is full of 30-plus-year-old tenure people. And even trying to get the bus drivers to drive several routes a day, right? You would think it's nothing complicated, right? Creates tons of different pushbacks. Step one that I do is first understand the underlying mindset, right? What is actually going through in their minds? So, for example, in that bus example, right, there are a couple of things going on. There's actually a disincentive implicit in the way that the drivers are being managed, right? That could result in that pushback. And so let's actually address the fundamental root causes. There are also people, not the drivers, but more on the sort of management level, that also push back because in a public utility company, right, people are trained to be risk averse. 即係多做多錯，少做少錯, right? So nobody wants to do anything, right? Because that's how they are trained. And you've got to create the right sort of upside for them, so that they actually have to do it. So you've got to address the underlying mindset and sort of incentive misalignments, right? That are in there. there are also practical tactics of influencing. So what I find is that sometimes as a leader, right, there are things that you can find someone else to say in a more effective way. So when the leader says something, right, people are going to second guess, your agenda and what have you. So in the first example, right, I actually hire a couple of retired instructors to talk to the drivers. Now in the sort of local Chinese settings, right, the C4, right, the instructor has a certain higher sort of social standing, and the guy knows his stuff. People may question whether I actually know my stuff, not having driven a bus in my life, right? But finding the right people to get that message across, I find it much more effective than trying to brute force it. So I think fundamentally, of course, right, it is quite contextual. But I think on the most important way is, I think one, understand the underlying mindset and address the mindset issue. Two is usually the pushback comes from some sort of incentive misalignment, and we have got to address that incentive misalignment. And three is find the right sort of, you need the right how to say 手段 in English. It's the right tactics, the right sort of people, and sort of you align them to do things for you, right? To actually make it happen. Finally, right? Still go back to the influence model, right? Also think about, have you actually done everything on this model, right? Was it enough of role modeling, communication, building of capabilities, as well as formal mechanisms, right? All that needs to be in place. So it's a general question. I try to tackle it in a targeted way, but that's how I think about it. So your pushback is people just simply don't want to try new things, right? So they're simply being change resistant, right? I've seen a lot of that in I think the bus companies is another good example. I think I will categorize 80% of the staff in that category, right? They are just categorically unwilling to try anything new. And I think there are a couple of things that I used to do, and I'll share what I did, right? And take what is worth in your context, because it is, everything is very contextual. Not unlike what I just said. I make sure I have the right people to have the right conversation. So I often ask someone else to say what I want to say for me. So for example, if a person A is quite change resistant, but he or she is pretty good friends with someone that is somewhat loyal to you, hopefully, right? You're trying to use that person to get your message across. That's what I do all the time. I rarely tackle it head on, because it is not, I'm not always the best person to say that message, right? So that's what I would do. Two is, I think it's really going back to those things that I just mentioned. What's the incentive misalignment, right? Is it because there is no upside for them to try something new? And then, you know what? When I try something new, right, I had past experience where I'm actually penalized for trying something new. Or maybe there's something else that I'm working on that if I do A, right, it takes away my attention or my resources or what have you, right? But figure out what is actually the world, right? It's all about aligning incentives fundamentally, right? It's not just money, right? It's about what is it that they're trying to achieve, and why is this change countering to their interest? So understanding their interest and mindset, right, and try to address it as much as you can, right, is fundamentally what it takes. Of course, there are a small number of people that are just hopeless, right, and hopefully that is a small percentage, right. Then you got to get people out of the way. So I would have very low tolerance with people. I can tolerate people who doesn't want to change, but I would not tolerate people who would have a toxic influence with the rest of the organization. That's something that you can't afford to have. And these guys gotta go, right? I mean, it's just the way it is. But if they're just individually resistant, right? Then figure out what is the misalignment in incentives and try to fix that. So let me sort of wrap this first section by a short 5-minute sort of action planning. Now, I think what I would ideally wanted to do is for everyone to start writing checklists and creating whiteboards, but that's going to take an hour. So without that hour span, right? What I would like everyone to do is to spend 5 minutes to think about, what are the things in your operation, right, that would be helpful to have either a checklist or a whiteboard. Try to put it on a pen on paper and then plan to do something about it. Now, I know that Vivica has a subsequent consultation session where I think maybe myself or somebody else, right, can give more help in making those checklists and whiteboards come to life, right? But at least start with that action planning so that we can take it to the next step. So why don't we take 5 minutes, do your individual planning, and then we'll move to the next session. Okay, so now I'm starting the people session on retention and succession. And I chose to start with this because I saw from the surveys that this is probably the number one thing that is the most impacting your operational resilience across different NGOs, okay? Now it's a complex topic. I spent a lot of time in every company that I worked in addressing this problem. So let me share a little bit on a couple of things that I would recommend everyone to actually do. Now, first and foremost, right, let's try to address the solvable retention issues, okay? There are some things that you can't solve, right? So if someone is getting paid another 50% higher, right, you can't really change that. But then in my experience across different companies, there is at least half the departures, right, that is at least partially addressable. And the way to do it is to take the discipline to assess the employer proposition. That means your proposition to the employee, and assess the flight risk for every single person, and take some deliberate action to increase the probability of retention. Now this is actually not an overkill, because as you think about two things, right? One is that when you have your staff leaving your NGO, right? Of course, it's going to impact your operations significantly. And secondly, do not take for granted for anybody, no matter how much they like you and love you, to actually stay in your NGO, because there are all sorts of things that can happen. And on this one, right, on the right hand side, in service organizations, there tends to be a number of common toolkits for increasing the probability of retention. Creating a sense of belonging, okay? How much do they actually like the workplace? Are there any people issues that you should be addressing? Any dynamics problems within the team? Make sure those are taken care of. How managers make them feel. So this is, maybe across different companies. If you look at a lot of surveys, right, the reason why people leave, often in the top 3, is because they didn't like their boss. And so if there are any issues on that front, right, make sure we address them. Creating learning and professional growth, especially for young people, right? Especially if we look at the younger generation, right? It's not about how much money they're making. It's not about any of that. It is about how much do they feel like they are learning and growing. And so make sure, even though you might be quite small, there are all sorts of ways that you can create learning to make sure that they are growing, and therefore continue to find your NGO quite rewarding to work in. And finally, make sure there is a alignment in the new employee expectation, right? That's also a common mistake where people are so into joining you for one reason. It turns out to be not quite what you said that it will look like. Okay, so that is actually quite important. Second part is identify internal candidates with high leadership potential and create a very clear path for them to move up. Now, on this one, I would like to highlight one thing, which is I will always assess not the performance, but the potential of the employee. And this is an important difference, because I've seen so many cases where people are over promoted because they perform well as an individual contributor, but terrible as a manager. and you only want to promote people that has the real potential in terms of the sensitivity to people. Can they actually lead? Can they influence? Right? All that is far more important. Otherwise, there are some staff, right, that are better off continue to be a senior, but still an individual contributor within the organization, but still create that path for them. Third is create a deputy for every manager. And this is important in two ways. One is that you, of course, want a backup, right? If someone somehow, is no longer around tomorrow, you want to have a backup. And you want to create that professional development, because by making someone a deputy, by right, that person is having a nice learning journey and therefore more likely to be sticking around with your NGO. The fourth is I take the discipline to do this in the past 10, 15 years of my career. I always do a lot of candid one-on-one mutual feedback and coaching sessions. It sounds basic, but very important, because the only way that you can find out about the flight risk and how happy they are and where they want to be is through these one-on-one candid chats. And they can take place in whatever way that makes you and your employee feel comfortable. It could be over a beer. It tends to be quite casual, by the way, but I always have a very fixed agenda of roughly 3 or 4 things. I always ask about what is it that they are happy about and what is it that they're not happy about. I always cover that. I always use the opportunity to give them the coaching and the feedback to help them become better. And then talk about it not in a sort of performance management way, right? I make it a distinctly different conversation. I make it a developmental conversation. I want to help you become a better professional, and therefore we are now having this chat. Of course, at the end, the NGO also benefit, right? Because if they do better, then you also do better. I always ask for their own feedback to me, or their direct supervisors. Sometimes you'll be quite surprised to find how much you can also learn from hearing from your employees. And finally, I make it a point to build the relationship, because, and I think this is probably more true for NGOs than even corporations, right? Which is, you do want to create that sense of belonging, and you want them to actually like you, and that likability and bonding, right, is rather essential for their retention. And finally, of course, not for every role, but maintain a talent pipeline. So I always talk to good talents, whether I'm looking for anyone or not, because I want to have a pool of people that I know that I can just call and say, hey, are you interested? Right? We've got new role opening up. So you're gonna have a talent pipeline open up. So I would highly recommend, given that almost all of you seem to find this a critical issue, right? To start taking the discipline to do 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the minimum, right? So if you have a large team, get your own team members, right? Because the key action party is always the immediate manager. So if you've got 3 layers in your organization, right? Get all 3 layers to do exactly that. Assess every person on their team, right? What is actually appealing to them and not appealing to them for you as an employer? What's the flight risk? Can you do something about it? Can you create some sort of learning? Create deputies? It is a multi-day exercise potentially, right? If you're doing it for the first time, but very rewarding in my opinion. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll briefly touch on this feedback model. So the reason why I highlight this feedback model is, especially in the Chinese culture, we are not always the most comfortable in giving candid feedback to people. But if you follow this framework, you will find that people are quite likely to react positively to you. And all my feedback, right, would go in this structure. I start with a very concrete observation, right? So it's a fact. So nobody if 即係佢唔中意咧，佢都唔可以同你 debate 嘅，其實係咪先？因為 you're starting with a fact, right? Which is what is the observation? What's the impact on you? Don't make it on them. What's the impact on you? And again, right? Nobody can debate this is making you, this is creating a negative impact from your point of view. Pause and listen to their any questions, and at the minimum, give a concrete suggestion, or better yet, lead them to come to the right conclusion by asking them questions, right? So the best way of influencing is not to tell somebody, but ask leading questions to get people to come to the same answer as what you want them to do. All right, so what is risk management? Now, let me put it in the context of today's module. Process and people continues to be the key, of course, right? I mean, your resilience is mainly around having process to govern and run things, but risk management is still a useful discipline to have. And I don't need to explain what risk is. But risk management is really around having a quarterly or a half-yearly process whereby you and your senior team go through what are the major risks, what are the probability of them happening, and what's the downside, and figure out, what are a few things that you need to take action on. Fundamentally, right, it is really around anticipation. And as I look at senior leaders, right, at some point you should get to the point where you make this into your everyday sort of life as opposed to a process to run necessarily. But that's what risk management is fundamentally about. And the number of typical risks, right? Economical, financial, loss of donor, for example, physical environment. Thankfully, in Hong Kong, a bit better depending on what you do. Technology, of course, data privacy breach is quite common these days. Legal compliance, especially if what you do is more subject to the compliance constraints. Reputation, media coverage, any sort of, especially if what you do it gets a bit more media attention, operational people. So I mean, the risk is endless, right? And it's not about going crazy with a risk management exercise. It's really about figuring out what are the things that can really impact you, and then take some action around it. That's really all it is. That's the risk register. Now, this slide may look very complicated, but it's actually not. Okay, so all this is saying is, in order to manage the risk, right? And by the way, you can feel free to simplify this, right? I think this in my past life, I used to use actually simpler ones. All we need to do is to have a brainstorming session with you and your senior team. Figure out what are the key sort of risk areas. Now, it doesn't have to be reputation or physical or what have you, right? It's just an example of the kind of risks. But pick the ones that you have. Start with a long list. It's okay to go a bit over, and then assess the likelihood of them happening, the severity of the downside if the risk were to materialize, and then what are the actions that we can take to actually mitigate them. And of course, have a clear owner and potentially a timeline for making it happen. Now, this is a classic sort of risk register, and people do large projects using tools like this. But I think from an NGO point of view, right? Let's be practical, because you only have that much time, you only have that much resources to address this, right? So keep it quite simple. In my past life, right, I would do things like this on a half-yearly, quarterly basis. That's it. That's really all you need. And don't go crazy in trying to address every risk that's out there, right? I mean, again, you only have that much time. So focus on the ones that have a medium or above probability of happening and a relatively large downside, and that's it, right? So again, it's always better to go 80-20, right? Do the 20% that can give you the 80% of the impact, right? And let's be done with it.